Thank you for this invitation to speak to the Global Citizens Festival in South Korea. My apologies, I'm not with you there in person, but I'm going to be talking about the importance of protecting heritage during conflict in the context of the current conflict in Ukraine. And the issue that we're going to be talking about is that cultural property, so heritage sites and buildings, libraries, archives, museums, galleries, is all damaged and destroyed during armed conflict. And there are two normal answers to that. Firstly, that there is no time to protect cultural property. We're fighting a war. We understand that. And secondly, that protecting people is far more important than protecting old ruins. And again, nobody disagrees with that. But the implications of failure to protect are seen in the image there with the looting of one of the storerooms at the National Museum in Baghdad in Iraq. So are these assertions correct? And my suggestion is no, they're not. Cultural heritage or cultural property can be protected if the process is started in peacetime, but it can't just be left to the heritage sector. It is a full government responsibility. Cultural property protection, which I use interchangeably as cultural heritage protection, must not be seen as an added burden to the military, but as an integral part of the military responsibilities and practice, and as what the military call a force multiplier. And it must also be seen as part of the humanitarian profile. So it's not just why is, though, cultural property protection important? Well, cultural property or heritage provides the tangible and the intangible link to the past that helps to provide individuals and communities with a sense of place, of identity, and of belonging. Yes, we must always put the safety and social, mental, and economic well-being of people first. But this equally means protecting their cultural property, as so much of their well-being is indivisibly intertwined with their cultural property. And it should be a key part of the thinking, policy, and practice of the uniformed, including the military, but also border control, customs, the police, humanitarian, and heritage sectors. And that helps us to build healthy, peaceful, stable, sustainable communities. And that leads to peaceful societies, which in turn, we hope, can lead to global peace. Cultural property defines who people are, but of course, and infrequently not contentiously, who they are not, who belongs and who does not, who is included and who is excluded. Cultural property can be used as a vehicle for understanding mutual recognition and peace building, as I've just said, but it can also, and frequently has been used, as an excuse and a target in conflict, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, with the so-called Islamic State attacks on the Yazidi, where attacks on their cultural property, their churches, their sacred places, were happening alongside the attacks on the people. Attacks on the cultural property of the Rohingya in Myanmar, and of course, attacks on the cultural property in Ukraine during the current conflict. So we must be aware of both the opportunity, but also the threat. Let me just take you back in history a little bit, and the failure of the royal families of Europe to stop the First World War led to the creation at the end of that conflict of the League of Nations. But the League of Nations was set up very simplistically to develop world peace through politics and economics. And that failed dramatically in 1939 with the advent of the Second World War. And so in the end of the Second World War, the League was replaced by the United Nations, with a major difference, and there that peace can only be established on the basis of humanity's moral and intellectual solidarity, and in particular through the United Nations agency UNESCO, through education, science, and culture. A major development and change. And that was seen in the Nuremberg trials at the end of the Second World War, where senior Nazis were prosecuted not only for the appalling crimes against the Jewish population and others, but also for crimes against cultural property, for the looting and damage and destruction of cultural property. And that same idea was incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 27, which provided the human right for everybody to their culture and implicitly to their cultural heritage, their cultural property. And then perhaps most important, and perhaps underpinning this, because the discussion had been going on around the Genocide Convention since the mid-1930s, where the original drafter of that convention, Raphael Lemkin, had two forms of genocide: barbarism and vandalism. Barbarism was genocide against people, but vandalism, which frequently predated barbarism, was genocide against their cultural property. And it was only in the last days of the convention to develop the Genocide Convention, of the conference to develop the Genocide Convention, that vandalism chapter was taken out at the insistence of the so-called settler states of America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, supported by ex-colonial powers such as the United Kingdom, because they were worried it would be used against them for their treatment of indigenous communities in their lands. So all of those had that concept that heritage, cultural property, was fundamental importance to world peace. And it was going to be tested and tried in court, as in the Nuremberg trials. And that came together in 1954 with the Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict and its two protocols. And the drafters of that envisaged and I quote from the documents, Red Cross for Cultural Property. And that was to be an equivalent of the International Committee of the Red Cross. The ICRC, looking after people, the Red Cross for Cultural Property, which was referred to as the blue and white shield, would look after their cultural property. But these ideas aren't new, and they weren't new in the 1950s. They have been around for 2,500 years, with Sun Shao in 6th century BC China, Polybus, Hugo Grotius, von Clausewitz, and the gentleman in the middle, Francis Lieber, all of whom, as military theorists, strategists, argued that to protect cultural property, in a gross simplification, was the first step to the next conflict, the first reason for the next conflict. So don't do it, but ever since almost everybody has. In 1996, 4 heritage organizations, 4 museums, sites and monuments, libraries and archives came together to create the Blue Shield, only 42 years late, following the 1954 conference, where it had been envisaged but not created. And it was named after the emblem identified in that 54 convention to identify cultural property protected under the convention. And the Blue Shield is an independent, impartial, and neutral organization. And that means we will not and do not point a finger of blame at any one party to a conflict. All we ask is that all parties to a conflict abide by their responsibilities, obligations, and the opportunities provided by protecting cultural property during conflict. So we do not and will not publicly denounce anybody. And in that way, we are able to work behind the scenes with everybody involved in a conflict. So our primary context is that 1954 Hague Convention and its protocols, but underpinned by much wider international law and the UN's strategic agendas and UNESCO's strategic agendas, so such as UN Security Council resolutions, and in particular, perhaps 2347. But we're also conscious of the Sustainable Development Goals and the major issues around climate change, for example, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And again, I stress we see cultural property protection as not something that the heritage sector can do on its own, but as a multi-sector responsibility and opportunity. And in the image there, you have one of my colleagues, now retired, Paul Fox, working with colleagues in NATO, adding in cultural property complications to their one of their exercises, trying to instill in NATO an understanding and a respect for cultural property, which will be to their benefit. With the ICRC, we had a major step forward when the then Director General of the ICRC, Yves Dacour, argued when we signed the MOU that protecting cultural property and cultural heritage against the devastating effects of war unfortunately remains a humanitarian imperative today, perhaps more than ever. And that's our goal, our aspiration, that we integrate cultural property protection across those three sectors. That is not going to happen in my lifetime, but if we don't start that work now, it will not happen in my children's lifetime. And we need to protect cultural property because cultural property, cultural heritage is that which makes us human. Thank you very much.